Hello everybody and welcome to my new ranking of the Dark Souls bosses, this time my favorite boss from each Souls game. Dark Souls is very well known for its bosses. In fact, many will consider Dark Souls to have the best bosses, the most challenging bosses, and the most aesthetically pleasing bosses in any game franchise or video game ever. And while I do agree that pretty much every boss in Dark Souls is really good, even though there are also some really bad ones, I definitely have my favorites. My last boss ranking and last Dark Souls ranking in general was my least favorite boss from each Souls game. So now I am just ranking my favorite boss from each Souls game, and I just want to say, if you like the video, and like it, subscribe it, subscribe, oh, I'm sorry, I messed it up. If you like the video, like it, subscribe, and share it to pretty much anyone you know. Without further ado, enjoy. Coming up on the #1 spot, Demon Souls. Demon Souls is often acclaimed to have the quote-unquote worst bosses in the series, or at the very least the most gimmicky. And yes, while I do think certain bosses like Phalanx, Adjudicator, Armored Spider, and definitely Dragon God are not the best bosses in the series by far, I don't think Demon Souls really has inherently awful bosses. However, the boss that definitely stands out the most is by far False King Allant. In general, False King Allant is a very fun boss fight. He's more akin to a Dark Souls 3, maybe late Dark Souls 1 boss than anything, but that doesn't make him a bad fight. It doesn't make him unfair, and it doesn't make him unbalanced either. Yes, the speed of him is a little bit more than the game can process and the game should suit, but that doesn't make it unfair by any means. It just makes his fight a little bit more of a challenge. And on the topic of challenge, Demon Souls typically has some really easy bosses. None of the bosses really ever give you a hard time or any bit of challenge. Except for Armored Spider or Dragon God, where the challenge is kind of just unfair. I can't really excuse Dragon God especially. God, I just hate him. But False King Allant feels like a genuine duel. He feels like a very perfect endpoint, but then it's ruined by the true King Allant, so that spectacle is gone. Speaking of spectacle, his arena, his crumbling throne looking outside on the kingdom is just absolutely badass, and I love it. But onto how he actually works as a boss fight. He has sweeping attacks, and his coolest things is definitely his wind attacks. I love how his slashes make wind fly out of his blade. It is really cool aesthetically, and it really makes you think about certain moves that he will pull off. And his soul drain ability that literally takes a level away from you is one of the cruelest things From Software has ever done. In general, he is just a really cool and fun boss fight, and by far my favorite in Demon Souls, and honestly one of my favorite in the series in general. Dark Souls 1 would probably go to Gwyn, Lord of Cinder. If I'm being honest, I don't really like that many Dark Souls 1 bosses, and Dark Souls 1 is probably my least favorite excluding Bloodborne. However, my favorite boss would definitely have to go to Gwyn, Lord of Cinder. There are some pretty good bosses, like Priscilla, like Ornstein and Smo. The Gargoyles are a wonderful duo fight introducing the topic of fighting multiple strong opponents at once. And what's her name? Quelaag is also a very wonderful boss. However, Gwyn just does the most for me. I do think he's a little bit too fast for Dark Souls 1, and there's not really many tells to his attacks, but that never really bothered me that much. If anything, it just makes this fight more complicated. However, there is one caveat that can make this fight an absolute joke. The fact that you can parry him. There's other ways you can sort of cheese his fight, like there's these pillars in his arena that you can hide behind, but that's really it. You can also summon Solaire, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you can shoot him outside of his arena. But if you actually don't parry him, there's a pretty good boss hidden behind this easy wall. First off, the Ashen Capital, I think is what it's called, is just a beautiful area. I wish they would have made this area more fleshed out. I think the architecture is just beautiful, but in general, the last half of Dark Souls 1 is pretty lackluster. The music for his boss fight is absolutely stunning too, and in general, he is just fun. He is difficult, but not too difficult. In fact, I think he's probably one of the harder bosses in Dark Souls 1 standards, and I just hope you guys enjoy his fight as much as me, and I love the nice little callback Soul of Cinder does in the third game, but we'll talk about the third game later. Dark Souls 2 has a lot of what people would consider the worst bosses in the series. Royal Rat Vanguard, Royal Rat Authority, Smelter Demon, Old Iron King, and in general just okay bosses like Nisandra. If there's one boss that I'd have to choose as my favorite, it would be the Looking Glass Knight. See, the Looking Glass Knight has actually always been my favorite, even when I first played the game when I was like 11 or so. I just love the aesthetic of his fight more than anything. The clapping thunder and the rain pouring down on you as you fight this elegant looking knight with his armor glistening from all sides. And he just looks cool. He has a really cool sword too that is covered in thorns, and he has a really cool shield that is a mirror. His whole gimmick is that he can occasionally make something summon from his shield, like an NPC. Or, if you're connected to the internet, there's a chance that an actual human player will fight alongside him. This is sort of similar to the old monk in Demon Souls, and I think that's a really neat callback if it was intentional. The boss's attacks are pretty bare bones. He has some sweeps, he has some slams, but honestly, my favorites are the ones where he uses thunder. He uses the rain to his advantage with this neat little gimmick added into his fight where, since it's raining, you take more damage from lightning-based attacks, which is just such a nice little detail they really didn't have to include. So if he uses one of his thunder attacks like his orbs, your health will be decimated in seconds. Overall, he's just a great boss, and my favorite boss in Dark Souls 2 by far. I can't really say anything else about him, so moving on to Bloodborne. The next boss would have to be Gerheim, German, however people pronounce it on the internet. He is definitely my favorite, and I feel like a lot of people's favorite if you exclude the amazing DLC bosses, which I have never fought. I've never played the Bloodborne DLC. Go ahead and shame me. But German is a wonderful fight by far. He has probably the coolest arena in the whole Souls franchise. This beautiful field of flowers is just, well, beautiful, and it really helps cap off the ending. It doesn't just make this fight intense. The fight is intense, but the flower field and the whole stakes and even the music, it makes this fight more beautiful than anything, which Dark Souls is really good at making their fights feel a certain way, whether it's triumphant, whether it's sad, whether it's beautiful, anything of the sort. Dark Souls boss fights can do it. He has a pretty fun moveset, a variety of scythe slashes, and he can even do his own hunter weapon switch thing. I don't know what the name for it is, where you can turn your weapon into something else. You can even get his weapon, and it is one of my favorite weapons in the whole franchise. Bloodborne may not be my favorite game, but it has some of my favorite weapons. He doesn't really have much to his second phase. He kind of just gains an AoE attack, and he becomes more powerful and more aggressive. He also uses a gun. However, there is one caveat to this fight that can also make him really easy if you're good at it. Parrying. I think normally this fight is really hard, and if you know how to parry, its difficulty decreases substantially. I don't know why FromSoft made these decisions to make final bosses parryable. I mean, it makes sense. Gwen is a human, and German is a human, and, you know, humans can be parried, but also certain beasts can, I guess. It doesn't make sense to me, and I think personally it kind of ruined his fight a little bit. Not in terms of general fight, just because his difficulty is a little lacking if you know how to parry. Overall, though, he is a fair, difficult, and really fun boss fight with some pretty neat, though not really outstanding mechanics. But he's my favorite boss in Bloodborne, so let's move on. Dark Souls 3 is my favorite Souls game to date, and chances are it will always be my favorite Souls game unless From Software does something absolutely groundbreaking in my standards. One reason why Dark Souls 3 has always been my favorite is the bosses. Like I've said before in previous videos, bosses are the most important part of Dark Souls for me. And Dark Souls 3 absolutely excels in that category, especially with this boss, Sister Fried. Sister Fried has been my favorite for a while. My favorite in Dark Souls 3 has always fluctuated. Sometimes it was Sister Fried, sometimes it was Soul of Cinder, sometimes it was Gale, Nameless King. But after some long thinking, it definitely goes to Sister Fried. Of course, the music in this fight is wonderful. Yet again, pretty much every Dark Souls boss has wonderful music, but I just like the whole aesthetic of her fight. Her arena also feels perfect. Her first phase isn't really much, she just has some scythe swipes, and there's this cool mechanic where she can go invisible, sort of like Priscilla, but if you're vigilant, you can see these little particles of snow fly up when she lands on the ground, because she goes invisible and she jumps and she lands, and you can get some free damage in there. Her first phase is so easy, but her second phase is when it gets really real. That doesn't even make sense. Why did I say that? Father Ariando himself wakes up from his slumber with a absolutely horrifying scream that has been used in memes, and I absolutely love it. And then the fight becomes a gank fight for a little bit. Father Ariando is the stereotypical big guy, does a lot of damage, while Fried sort of hangs back and she attacks every now and then using ranged options. I really like their dynamic. Father Ariando has these huge slams, he even has this fire breath attack, and Fried kind of stays back and uses her ranged frost abilities, and she can also heal. They complement each other very well. However, I do think this is probably my least favorite phase in the fight. Father Ariando and Sister Fried, while they do go really well together, I just don't enjoy that fight nearly as much as even the first phase, but the third phase is when the boss fight absolutely exceeds in every category. The music gets intense. Sister Fried has this amazing startup animation, and she gets this black flame add-on to her attacks. And black flame is probably my favorite thing in Dark Souls 3. It just looks so cool, and it also is really powerful too. And Sister Fried uses it to her advantage very well. She has these very spastic but elegant attacks. I especially love the one where she jumps up in the air and she comes down and it is just an explosion of black flame sprawling in different directions. It's so cool. Her attacks are just also really cool to look at, and they're really fun to dodge. She is also a very challenging boss too, which I really like that. The fight doesn't go on for too long despite having 3 phases either. I think it's a pretty good length, and it feels fair enough to the point where, you know, you won't really get mad. Maybe when you first play the game you will, because this is the hardest boss up to this point, I'd argue, until you get to the Ring City and you fight some of the other bosses. But aside from them, Sister Fried, definitely the hardest boss, but the most fair and the most mechanically interesting and fun. Now, Sekiro is a really difficult pick for me because I love pretty much all the bosses. In my last video, I even said I don't have a dislike boss, so I just had to choose one that I wouldn't really consider my most favorite in any regard. I mean, you have great bosses like Old Lady Butterfly, Great Shinobi, Owl, Ishin, Nichiro. That's just 4 that I can name off the top of my head. However, if I had to choose, it would probably be Ishin the Sword Saint. You fight this version of Ishin by just going through the game normally, I believe, and this is the Ishin I got. I kind of found Sekiro a bit easy. It took a little bit to learn its mechanics, but once you do, the game can be a breeze. But when I got to this boss, all of it changed immensely. I think when I got to this boss, I had about like maybe around 15 hours in Sekiro. I didn't have a lot of time, but it went from 15 to 25, almost 30 when I got to this boss. I was awful at this boss, and I just couldn't beat him. He took me so long. I remember what I'd have to do just to keep me sane was I'd just have to hop on calls with my friends on Discord while I would fight him, and I'd have to talk to them while I'd fight him just so I wouldn't go insane and break something. I am nowhere near a master at Sekiro's mechanics either, which heavily inflict why this boss was so difficult to me, but he was so great, and I feel like if I didn't have this much of a hard time with him, I would not consider him my favorite at all. I don't really like how he always starts as Genichiro, and you have to beat Genichiro every single time you die to him. The time really adds up, and it gets annoying after a while. It just gets repetitive and monotonous, but it's not a huge part of the fight. After you beat Genichiro, though, that's when the real fun starts. This guy has three phases. Most Dark Souls bosses have two. And a third phase, one more, may not seem like too much to the average person, but really it is. His first phase kind of reminds me of False King a lot. He has some slashes that cause wind. And his first phase in general is pretty basic. He has some difficult to dodge attacks, and it is difficult to maneuver around him. But his second phase is when it really picks up in difficulty. First off, this guy pulls out a gun, and he will shoot you. This guy somehow knew how to get a gun, and he is not afraid to shoot you like the average pedestrian walking down the streets of Detroit. He also uses a spear, and the spear is something about the spear is just really difficult for me to dodge. I can't dodge this thing for the life of me. So this boss fight, the videos I'm watching, sometimes he's like 10 minutes long. It probably took like 20 minutes for me because I was a little baby man and I would just constantly run away from him. Am I proud of that? Absolutely not. I wish I could have just went in there, but I am too scared to do that. In his third phase, he brings in some thunder and stuff, and really, this fight is a huge endurance challenge. It really tests your patience if you're like me, and I'm not a very patient person, so I'd make some moves that were really risky, and then I'd die, and then I'd have to go through another 10, 15 or so minutes fighting this guy again just to die at the very end. I remember literally screaming when I beat this guy, and this is like the first time that's ever happened when I've beaten a boss. I beat this game like 2-3 years ago, I think, and oh my god, most satisfaction I've ever felt from a game. Thank you, Sekiro, definitely one of my favorites. Anyway, moving on to the last entry, Elden Ring. Elden Ring is a very problematic game for me. I was nowhere near as excited as most FromSoft fans when I saw the trailer for this game, but nonetheless, I was still very hyped for it. See, my favorite thing in Dark Souls has always been the bosses, and if you ask me, Elden Ring fails in that category. I dislike most of the Elden Ring bosses, but I won't waste your time with that. If I were to pick my favorite boss, it would have to be Morgott. Morgott is just the most balanced and fun boss to me. I think he has a little bit too little health, but that doesn't really matter to me that much. And yes, he basically is just Margit but on steroids, but that doesn't matter to me at all. I like Margit as a first boss, and Margit, while he did absolutely beat me when I first played the game, he's not really much of a challenge now that I've played the game a few times. Morgott isn't anything outstanding, mind you. He has some pretty decent sword swipes, and he has some decent openings, and he does have the Elden Ring problem of sometimes having an infinite combo chain, but the least from what I've noticed. He also has this really cool attack where he makes these little holy swords fall from the sky onto you, and that's really all I have to say about him. I wish I could say more, and I hate to end the video this way, but I don't have much to say about the Elden Ring bosses, because one, I don't really like Elden Ring that much, and two, I haven't really played it that much. I don't enjoy it. But anyway, if you enjoyed the video, let me know. Let me know things I could do better, things that you like, or like the video if you did. And subscribe, of course. It helps out a ton, but not saying you have to. Just do it if you want to. Thank you for watching to this point, and I really appreciate it. So I'll see you guys in the next video. Hope.